We are going to talk about the central nervous system, and I was going to bring a model of a vertebrae.
I was more so annoyed. I was like, oh no.
Be right back. Don't y'all talk about me now, I've got it on time.
Shoot, if that was the case, I would have failed every quiz. No, when she said she was like, gonna increase like the test, I was like, oh no. Everyone took me to have to take that test next time. I was like, I already don't like taking tests. You're gonna make me longer. Oh my god. I'll be like, oh crap. It just mark it down and fit like this by. And that was 5 questions. She should make that bonus. Huh? Make it bonus. Yeah, she should bump up my grade. I can't even know what my grade is in this class. Because they do like points. I already did like all the extra credit. It doesn't appear at all. Maybe my grade don't work out too well to get to.
Okay. Brought a model that has 3 vertebrae, and you will see in the middle, or between each, there will be a spongy-like substance. These are the discs, okay? You will notice that the way that they stack on top of each other, they form, for lack of a better word, a little tunnel. And the spinal cord goes down that tunnel. And then you have nerves that will enter and exit. So, the spinal cord, it is protected by 24 vertebrae. Vertebrae, we break it up into several regions. We talk about the cervical vertebrae, the thoracic, the lumbar, the sacral, and then the coccyx. The coccyx and sacral really are not vertebrae, but they are involved with the spinal cord. You've got your afferent nerves, which we have talked about, and your efferent nerves, okay? The brain, it weighs about 3 pounds. It is estimated to have about 15 billion neurons. The film that I will show you is updated where the doctor will tell you more, and they've even discovered more since then. Okay, we know that the brain is divided into 2 halves called hemispheres. It's divided into 3 areas: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. Okay? Now, the hindbrain, we're going to talk about 3 distinct structures in that area. One's called the cerebellum, one is called the pons, and one is called the medulla. Now, cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla. Okay? This is the hindbrain. Cerebellum, you've got the pons and the medulla. Cerebellum. Well, cerebellum is involved in many things. The word cerebellum actually means little brain, and actually it has two hemispheres, just like the big brain has. Okay? Now, not only is it involved in movement, balance, and posture, it also influences memory, impulse control. It has some language functions and also some higher order cognitive processes. The pons. It connects the hemispheres at the hindbrain level. It connects the two halves of the brain at the hindbrain level, okay? It also is important in sleep and arousal. Now, unless I say differently in this part of the class, arousal here means wakefulness and consciousness. We're not talking about sexual arousal. The medulla, again, part of the hindbrain. This controls many of the vital functions. Breathing, swallowing, circulation of the blood, blood pressure, the heart rate. Now, I'm going to tell you, a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. It can also be it can also give you a feeling of helplessness. Now, before I forget, since we pass this thing around, I'm going to pass around these wipes so that you can clean your hands and make sure that nobody transmitted anything. My mother was hospitalized for several months before she passed away. At one point, I came in and they were taking her away for more tests. And I said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Well, we think that she's having trouble swallowing, and we're taking her down for a swallow test." Came back and they said, "Well, she's almost 100% enabled to swallow now." And the second, they said, "We've already done CTs and we've already done MRIs. We cannot find a reason why she has stopped swallowing." They said, "She hasn't had a stroke. We cannot find any reason." With the little knowledge of brain structure and brain function that I've got, my first thought was, I wonder if this is the first part of the brain that is starting to shut down. All of a sudden, she couldn't swallow anymore. Sadly, that was exactly what was going on. Very shortly, different areas of her brain started slowing or stopping. But knowing that the medulla was very, very influential in controlling swallowing, that was my first suspicion. The midbrain. You have a structure within the midbrain called the reticular formation. Now, the reticular formation is located in the midbrain, but it has fibers that go up into the forebrain and down into the hindbrain. So actually it has parts in all three areas, but the most of it is going to be located in the midbrain. Now, for a lack of a better way of describing the reticular formation, I'm going to call it the gatekeeper for consciousness. Now, what I'm going to do is a very, very, very simplified explanation that the A&P people would probably be horrified, but it gives you the idea of what's going on, okay? Let's say for a minute, you've had a hard semester and spring break comes. You decide to go to your cousins so that you can get away from everything, get some R&R, you can chill, you can sleep. I mean, it'll just be a break of nothing but catching Z's. Well, you get there and your cousin shows you the room, and I mean, the bed is calling. You lay down and you go to sleep, and very shortly after you go to sleep, you hear this bong, and you wake up and you go, oh, that's just the grandfather clock. A little bit later, the air conditioning comes on, and you wake up and say, oh, that's just the air conditioner. Pretty soon, the refrigerator comes on. That wakes you up. And so, little things like that wake you up all night, on and on. Next day you get up, your cousin says, well, how'd you sleep last night? You say, oh, I guess I'm just not used to the mattress. I kept waking up last night. Wasn't the mattress, it's our friend, the reticular formation. The reticular formation is the gatekeeper for consciousness. So, you're asleep and the gate's closed. Okay? Now, the grandfather clock goes off, bong, and your reticular formation is not really sure what that is. So, it opens the gate, you wake up. Now the information goes to higher parts of the brain, and you say, oh, that's just the grandfather clock. And so the reticular formation says, okay, and you go back to sleep. The air conditioning goes off. What is that? It's just the air conditioner. Okay. Pretty soon the refrigerator goes off. Don't know what that is. It's just a refrigerator. After about the third day, the refrigerator goes off and your reticular formation lets you sleep. The air conditioner goes off and it lets you sleep. The clocks go off and it lets you sleep. Because somehow it knows, okay, it's okay. And so when it opens, you wake up and you're conscious. You know what's going on. The information's going to the brain. When it closes, you sleep. The problem with the reticular formation, if something happens and causes it to close the gate, you can be in a permanent coma. That can cause somebody to be in a permanent coma. And so the reticular formation is our friend. Okay? We like for it to have the ability to open and close. Okay? We don't want it to stay closed all the time. On the other hand, we don't want it to stay open all the time either. Because we can't function if we don't get sleep. After so many days of absolute no sleep, a person can go psychotic. You know, I have people say, well, I never dream. Yeah, you do. You don't know what you're dreaming, you don't remember what you're dreaming, but you dream because if you're deprived of dreaming, you can go psychotic. As soon as you start getting your rest and going back to sleep and getting those Z's, it will recede. But the fact is, we need our sleep, and the reticular formation is our friend. It is in the and midbrain, and the next thing is the forebrain. Now, we are going to talk about the thalamus and the hypothalamus, the corpus callosum and the limbic system. Thalamus, the hypothalamus, the corpus callosum, and then a different side has the limbic system. I love MRIs. Now, this is an MRI. It is a very detailed picture of the brain that the radiologist can give us through nuclear medicine. Okay? Now, very distinctly, here's the cerebellum, here's the pons, there's the medulla, there's the thalamus, you've got the hypothalamus, and here, corpus callosum. Okay? Right. Well, where I called the reticular formation the relay system, I'm going to call the gatekeeper, I'm going to call the thalamus the relay system. Okay, now, let's say that the optic pathway brings in information where a guy has seen a real pretty girl. Well, the thalamus is part of that optical pathway. And the thalamus will relay the information to a different part of the brain for higher processing. You hear a special song. And the olfactory, not olfactory, that's not right, auditory. The auditory pathway sends that information about that song to the thalamus, and the thalamus relays it to a different part of the brain for processing. Then you've got your gustatory pathway, and you eat that incredible brownie. And part of the gustatory pathway is has the thalamus included. And it'll take that information and it will relay it to a different part of the brain. And then you have touch. The thalamus is part of its pathway, and the information comes into the thalamus and it relays it to a different part of the brain. So we can actually call the thalamus the relay system of the brain. Okay? Now, I just told you something very important, but y'all see anything there that is kind of interesting or that noteworthy? Do what?
There's no sense of smell listed?
Absolutely. That's absolutely perfect. The sense of smell does not go through the thalamus. It's the only sense that does not go through the thalamus. So, that was very good, very noteworthy, and I'm glad that you picked up on that. Because that's going to be important in a minute when we talk about the limbic system. The hypothalamus, nicknamed the pleasure center of the brain. It is very powerful. It's very influential. It regulates thirst, hunger, sleep, and sex. The drives for those areas. And it has a part of it called the suprachiasmatic nuclei. Now, I say it's very influential, very powerful. They did an experiment with rats. They took some rats, put them in a cage, and they taught them that if you push this lever, it'll dispense food. Rats are very, very smart. Very, very smart. It took them little time at all to figure out, you all you have to do is hit that lever and you can eat, and they're always hungry. So they're, you know, they're content rats now. They take those rats and they attach an electrode to their brain. Now, when the rats received a shock through that electrode, the resulting response was that would be equated to an orgasm in a human. Now they put them in a cage, and if they pushed the lever, they could give themselves basically an orgasm. So, they were very pleased with that one. Dilemma. Let's put them in a cage. They can have all the food they want or all the orgasms they want. Well, here goes the rats. Almost starved themselves to death. It's very influential, very powerful. Now, I told you about suprachiasmatic nuclei. This is a part of the brain that regulates our daily type of rhythm, our daily type of calendar or clock. If you get hungry every day at 7 o'clock in the morning for breakfast, that's because of the suprachiasmatic nuclei. We abbreviate that the SPN. Okay? If you get hungry at noon, that's because of the suprachiasmatic nuclei. If you get hungry at 6 o'clock at night, that's because of the, it's SCN, the suprachiasmatic nuclei. If you get sleepy at 10 o'clock, that's because of the suprachiasmatic nuclei. It regulates these type of daily activities and puts us on a schedule, okay? Now, this can be interrupted and it can foul us up. Can y'all give me maybe an example of how our what's called a circadian rhythm, how our circadian rhythm could be screwed up? We're about ready to have to go through it in a couple of weeks. Time change. Absolutely. It takes us a little while to adapt to either getting up an hour earlier. It's easier for me to adapt to sleeping an hour later. But that's an interruption in our circadian rhythm. Now, what do you think would happen if somebody worked 11 to 7, 30 years, then retired and said, well, I can get on a regular routine and live life like everybody else. What do you think would happen?
Their body will automatically be like, if they work 11 to 7, their body will automatically stay up on those calls.
You're saying it would automatically return to it?
It'll be hard to get out of it.
That's it. It can take 3 years for their body to recondition something that has been ingrained for 30. And so, yes, it can be a very difficult thing to change. Another example of messing with our circadian rhythm, you fly from one time zone to another. I made the mistake one time of flying east on the weekend of the time change. So that ended up 2 hours screwing with my circadian rhythm. So if I was going to get up at 6 here, I would end up getting up at what would have been our time 4. You know, it just really can mess you up. Don't ever go east during a time change. So we've got the hypothalamus, extremely important. And this is not the last time we're going to be talking about the hypothalamus. We're going to be talking about the hypothalamus many times from now on. Now, in the blue, that's the hypothalamus. Hypo means under. It's a medical term that means under or beneath. So it is properly named. Hypothalamus, it's under or beneath the thalamus, okay? The corpus callosum, this is a band of tissue that connects the hemispheres, the 2 hemispheres at the forebrain level. It connects the 2 hemispheres at the forebrain level. Now, along with that, it also is a bridge of communication between the 2 hemispheres. Okay? They had 2 doctors. They had a patient that was having severe epileptic seizures. They were trying everything they knew to try and calm those seizures, but they couldn't. Even with using all the protocol, all the medications, everything they knew, the seizures were not subsiding. In case you don't know, when a person has what we used to call a grand mal seizure, the seizure that encompasses the entire body, it's extremely hard on the body. It's extremely dangerous, okay? If you have too many of these too close together, it can be a life-threatening situation. So they were faced with a life-threatening situation for their patient. Nothing they were doing was working. He was continuing to have seizures. What do we do? Well, these 2 doctors, what are we going to do? We don't know what to do. You know, there's nothing else that we know. And they got to brainstorming with each other, and one of them said, you know, I wonder if the seizures are starting on one side and then migrating across the brain. And the other one said, well, you know, that makes sense. He said, I wonder what would happen if we cut the corpus callosum. They went to the guy and they said, you know, this is basically the last thing we've got. It hadn't been done, but I'm telling you, you know, we've got to do something for you. Well, he said, well, go for it, you know. And they severed that corpus callosum, the tissue, the band of tissue that connects the 2 hemispheres. Well, it also serves as a communication bridge, because when they severed that corpus callosum, the seizures stopped. even if it started on this side, it didn't gain the momentum to be able to involve the entire brain. So it calmed and the patient was saved. You're going to have a movie next week, and it's going, one of the things the doctor is going to talk about is the anterior cingulate cortex. It surrounds the corpus callosum. It is important in cognitive flexibility, in our being able to shift our attention from one thing to another, in our ability to correct errors, to go from one idea to another idea, to be able to actually identify options, to be able to go with the flow, and to be able to cooperate. What happens if that anterior cingulate develops a problem? That's me, that's my ringtone. If the anterior cingulate develops problems, the person will get stuck in his thinking. He won't be able to go from this to this as fast. He'll have a propensity to worry more and to hold grudges. They will have the ability to obsess more. They will have a inclination toward having more compulsions, and also it can fit into addictions. Now, the limbic system. The limbic system is involved in emotions, in memory, and the two structures of the limbic system that we're going to talk about is called the amygdala and the hippocampus. The amygdala is very important in our emotions. It's very important in regulating behaviors such as aggression. And remember when I told you that the sense of smell does not go through the thalamus? That's because it goes through the amygdala. Okay? Now what happens is it will lock a smell, a memory, and an emotion together. Now, let's say that you go into a friend's house and all of a sudden you have this wonderful aroma of an apple pie, and your thoughts go immediately to your grandmother's house. You say, oh wow, I used to love my grandmama's pies. Well, the amygdala took the memory of an apple pie and locked it with an emotion, happiness, and then locked it with the smell, the memory, and the emotion. Okay? So it locks all three of those together. A guy walking down the hall, and somebody has Old Spice on, and he thinks, my granddaddy used to wear Old Spice, and he said, you know, happiest memory I ever had with him was when we went fishing that time. Okay? The amygdala, that's where the memory came from. Now, I've given you happy examples. It can also bring up unhappy examples. A woman walking down the hall and she smells a certain aftershave, and she's been abused by somebody that wears that aftershave, that can bring her in to even hysterics, fear, anger, all of these things, because now the amygdala has locked that memory of abuse with the smell of the aftershave, okay, and the behavior. And so the amygdala is and sense of smell is a very powerful sense, and it can bring memories back very quickly. And the amygdala has a lot to do with that, because it has a lot to do with emotions. You've got the hippocampus, which has a lot to do with recent memories, with things that have happened recently. And if this gets damaged, it'll impact your short-term memory. Okay? 51st dates. Has anybody seen that? Okay. Normally, I used to have classes that would always bring that up. It's a show about a guy that meets this girl and he just head over heels with her. But she had a terrible traumatic brain injury. And after 24 hours, she doesn't remember anything that happened before then. So he tries to create new dates. Every day he takes her out on another date, hoping that he can start helping her to build, get back to normal. All right, here's where the limbic system is. The amygdala is right in here. Okay? Hippocampus is right in here. Now here, you've got the amygdala, here you've got the hippocampus. The reason, this is where you have taken the hemisphere, the right hemisphere, and where you've got the right hemisphere like that, you've sliced it, taken off the top half, and you're looking down into that right hemisphere, but that inside layer, okay? Well, the outer part of the hemispheres are called the cerebral cortex. We've already talked about the halves of the brain, the hemispheres. You've got the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. Now, if you look at a brain, you will see little valleys, okay? The little valleys are called sulci, and the little bumps are called gyri, okay? Sulci are the valleys, gyri are the ridges. Then we have the lobes of the brain. Now, when I talk about the corpus callosum, the right head, the right hemisphere, and the left hemisphere, they both have that structure. Okay? The cerebellum, they both have that structure. So things that I was referring to, unless I tell you different, are located in both halves of the brain for our purposes. In talking about function, we refer to the lobes of the brain. Okay? Now, if you remember the phrenology, and they would feel the lumps and bumps on a person's head, and they tried to say, well, this bump right here represents where, they've got this characteristic of that. They had the right idea, but they didn't go literally deep enough. The lobes of the brain will show us where the different functions are located. You've got the frontal lobes, the parietal lobes, the occipital lobes, and the temporal lobes. The frontal lobes, they are involved in motor activity. Parietal There's where your touch, your pain, and your temperature functions are located. The occipital is the sight, and the temporal is the hearing. Now, your parietal is up here. The temporal is the easiest one to remember because hearing and the temporal is right above the ears. So it's real easy to remember temporal above the ears, okay? The sight is in back of the head. The frontal is right up in here, okay? Here we have the right hemisphere of the brain, and again, the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, and the temporal. The cerebellum is not considered a lobe. Again, now here on the left side, you have the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, and the temporal. Motor cortex deals with movement. Okay. The prefrontal cortex, it deals with focus, forethought, impulse control, organization, planning, judgment, empathy, and insight. Focus, forethought, impulse control, organization, planning, judgment, empathy, insight. If the prefrontal cortex is damaged, it can cause a short attention span. It can cause a person to be much more impulsive, also to procrastinate, to exhibit poor judgment, a lack of empathy, and a lack of insight. The sensory cortex is made up of the 3 lobes that are responsible for different sensory functions. The parietal lobe, sensory functions, touch, temperature, and pain. Occipital, vision. Temporal, hearing. The temporal lobe functions, understanding language, long-term memory, auditory processing, mood stability. It assists in controlling your temper and also reading social cues. Is that thing still running?
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah.
No?
Mm-hmm.
It is?
It is.
Also, if your temporal lobe is damaged, it can cause emotional instability, memory problems, feelings of panic, problems with aggression and headaches, and also can cause problems in learning. Now, we've got a cortex that we group the pain, touch, temperature, hearing, and vision all under the sensory cortex, and we have the motor functions under the motor cortex, but there are some functions that really don't fall under any of those. Things like language. Language isn't really motor and it's not really sensory. So they create what's called the association cortex. And two examples of things that are grouped under there are language and nonverbal skills. Language, there was a doctor named Paul Broca. Now, Paul Broca had a patient that was terminal. And as he declined in health, his language functions declined. Got to the point that he could only say one word at the point when he was basically totally disabled. The only word he could say was tan, T-A-N. And so, you know, you'd say, well, would you like your pillows fluffed? Tan. Are you hungry today? Tan. Everything, the only word he could say was tan. Well, got to the point that the hospital nicknamed him Tan. And Tan died, and Dr. Broca did an autopsy. And in doing an autopsy, he found that there was a lesion on a part of his brain in the left frontal hemisphere. He surmised that that was a language center. He wrote a paper on it, and it was verified several years later, and so because he was the one that identified it and wrote the paper, they named this Broca's area. So this is Broca's area right there, okay? It is a language function area. Now, Wernicke's area is in the temporal lobe, and it can become damaged very easily. Very, very easily. And one way to damage it is through abuse of alcohol. There is a condition called Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. And a person has literally drank themselves into brain damage that cannot be reversed. And it will affect their memory, their speech, even their gait, to the point that in some ways they will appear drunk, even though they haven't had anything to drink. And how long? So, there is Wernicke's area. We'll come back around in a second. You can see Wernicke's area right there. Now, if a person has a deficit in nonverbal skills, it's called apraxia. Okay? Now, an example of apraxia is dressing. You know, we take so many things for granted. You know, you get up in the morning and you put on your shirt, you put on your slacks, you put on your socks, you put on your shoes, you tie your shoes. When I broke my thumb, I started appreciating some of the things that we take for granted. Try buttoning a shirt without your thumb. It's really tough. Try tying a shoe without a thumb. You know, I had to get me some Velcro shoes because I couldn't tie my shoes. So a deficit in nonverbal skills, an example is being able to dress. If you weren't able to dress yourself, then they might describe that as an area of apraxia. Now, on Tuesday, and I do know that we're coming back on Tuesday this time. On Tuesday, we're going to start talking about the number one cause of brain damage in adults, and that's called a stroke. Now, quite frankly, this is one lecture that I think that I present to my students that they really, really say they get a lot out of. It clarifies a lot of things for them, and quite frankly, I have fun teaching it. I used to be an EMT instructor, and so I thoroughly enjoy teaching this and seeing my students benefit from the information. So that's what we're going to start out with. Any questions?